The world around us isn't just changing. It feels like it's, well, rearranging itself at this absolutely dizzying, accelerating pace. You know, whether you're navigating your career, your personal life, or honestly just trying to make sense of the daily news, it feels like the ground is constantly shifting beneath our feet. And in this age of, let's face it, constant uncertainty, the critical question isn't just how we cope, but how do we actually win? That's precisely what we're plunging into today. Our deep dive is into Max McKeown's incredibly insightful book, Adaptability, the art of winning in an age of uncertainty. Our mission right now is to really unpack the core principles and compelling stories from his material that show us how to not just survive, but, truly thrive when the future is, quite frankly, pretty unforeseeable.
And that's really the heart of McKeown's argument, isn't it? Adaptability isn't just some passive reaction. It's a dynamic three-part process. First, it's about recognizing that genuine need to change, and honestly, that's often the toughest bit, getting past denial. Second, it's about truly understanding what kind of change is necessary, really digging in. And finally, it's taking decisive, smart action to make it happen. Throughout our chat today, we'll keep coming back to these key ideas: recognize, understand, act, using some really fascinating real-world examples that just bring it all to life.
Okay, let's start by confronting a hard truth McKeown lays bare. Often the biggest threat to success isn't, a lack of talent or resources. It's a stubborn inability to adapt quickly enough. He calls this the fatal gap. Okay. To really get this, we need to look at some striking, maybe even shocking examples. Think about the U.S. military's shock and awe strategy in Iraq back in 2003. McKeown uses this for Rule 1, play your own game. Now, this principle, it's not just about military tactics. It's about understanding your specific environment and refusing to fight on terms that don't suit you, even if they're the conventional way. Initially, that overwhelming force, the shock and awe, it seemed to work. President Bush even declared mission accomplished, remember?
Right. I remember that clearly. But as the book vividly points out, the resistance hadn't actually stopped. It had just adapted. They adapted to the fact that winning by U.S. rules was impossible. So the Iraqi resistance quickly dispersed, fragmented, completely changing the battlefield. The U.S. strategy, though, it was, and this is McKeown's phrase, excruciatingly, dangerously slow to adapt to that new reality. And what's even more critical here is the historical amnesia. The U.S. military had warnings. They had lessons from Vietnam, lessons from the USSR and Afghanistan, lessons the U.S. itself kind of helped teach. Yet despite knowing all this, there was what McKeown calls a refusal to adapt. It just hammers home that the estimated time to adapt, that critical gap between when things change and when an organization actually responds, it can be absolutely fatal.
Fatal, yeah. And that fatal gap, it isn't just for military strategy, is it? We see it again and again in the corporate world, often driven by what McKeown calls institutional inertia. He talks about UBS, the bank, and their harrowing struggles with toxic debts. They survived over $50 billion of them. But their leadership, even with, quote, overwhelming evidence for change, they just clung to this strategy of confidence-boosting denial.
Exactly. And that ties straight into Rule 5. Stability is a dangerous illusion. That's a pretty provocative statement, right? Because for so many organizations, stability is the goal. It's what you aim for.
Of course. You feel safe.
Right. So how do you convince leaders that what feels safe is actually a trap? McKeown argues it's a cognitive bias, a comfort zone thing. The apparent stability at the top of UBS probably convinced them they could just ride it out, avoid adapting. Their CEO's predecessor even talked about restoring trust, profitability, and stability just days before he had to resign. But it was precisely those deep, embedded institutional habits, those comfortable, established ways of thinking and operating that had them locked in. McKeown's point is it's not just about logic, it's about the deep, almost visceral discomfort of deliberately shaking things up, causing instability within a system that feels safe. It's like organizational self-preservation, even when it's leading you off a cliff.
Wow. That institutional inertia we saw with UBS, that's one kind of failure to adapt. But what about when a company seems aware of new threats, but then makes an almost unbelievable strategic mistake? McKeown highlights this with a concept he calls stupid survives until smart succeeds, and the cautionary tale of Borders bookstores. Oh, it's a painful classic example. Remember Borders? Huge in the 90s, expanding everywhere, a real giant. But then came what McKeown calls their blunder of epic proportions, a strategic misstep that basically cost them everything. They shut down their own online bookstore after just 1 year. And then, incredibly, they partnered with Amazon.com. They handed over, get this, 7 years of learning to their key rival. All that customer data, the talent, the early vision, just given away.
It's almost hard to believe, isn't it? And this is where Barnes& Noble provides such a stark contrast. Okay, they were slower than Amazon, no doubt, but they did launch barnesandnoble.com within a couple of years. They made mistakes too, for sure, but by staying in the online game, they kept learning. Eventually, they brought out their own e-reader, the Nook, to directly challenge Amazon's Kindle. They didn't exactly win the online war, but crucially, they continued to adapt, and they still exist today. It just reiterates McKeown's point. Adaptability isn't a one-time fix. It's continuous. It's a process. It's not just about being first mover, but about being open to new realities, even the ones that seem kind of absurd at first, and just relentlessly learning from your own experience and, yeah, from your competitors, too.
That's such a crucial distinction, not just being first, but that relentless learning and openness. But how do you actually cultivate that openness, especially to ideas that seem absurd, particularly when your established way, like Borders, has brought you success? Is it down to leadership, or is it something deeper, like in the organization's DNA? We've looked at the traps of sticking to the old ways, but what about when real innovation sparks from completely defying the obvious? McKeown digs into this really interesting concept he calls embracing unacceptable wisdom. That's in Rule 3. What does that actually mean in practice? And how do you even spot that unacceptable wisdom? Okay, take the tiny Italian village of Filatino. The government mandated that villages under 1,000 residents had to merge. Most towns just grumbled. But Filatino, with only 544 residents, did something totally radical. They declared independence, printed their own money, the Fiorito, even planned to invite a deposed Italian royal to be their new prince. Seriously.
It's a brilliant example, isn't it? It perfectly illustrates McKeown's idea of looking beyond the immediate situation. They weren't just complaining. They looked to the past. Italy used to be full of principalities, and they looked at successful present examples like San Marino, Monaco, Liechtenstein. Small, independent states. And what's really fascinating is how they amplified their non-obvious way. They used social media, built a website, got international attention. That collective belief in an unacceptable wisdom wasn't just some quirky idea. It actually empowered them to act in a way nobody expected. It's about finding that hidden, unconventional path.
Or think about the amazing story of Levi's WaterLess jeans. Carl Chiara, their director of brand concepts, was really bothered by the industry standard. 42 liters of water just to finish one pair of jeans. That was the acceptable wisdom, but he found it unacceptable. He was, as McKeown puts it, stubborn about finding a waterless solution. He literally invented new methods, stone washes without stones, rinsing with resin instead of water. Really thinking outside the box. The result, a mind-blowing 96% reduction in water use. And here's the really counterintuitive part. Instead of guarding it like a secret, they shared the innovation. With other manufacturers, they even partnered with Matt Damon's Water.org. These examples just powerfully show that curiosity, it isn't just about discovery. It's about a relentless willingness to challenge the status quo, even when it's uncomfortable, or seems crazy to others, or maybe even helps your competition.
And this connects back to a profound, almost disturbing insight from the Milgram experiment, which McKeown also references under Rule 3. You know, the one those shocking psych studies where volunteers thought they were giving painful electric shocks just because an authority figure told them to? Conformance was stronger than their compassion, as McKeown notes. But, and this is crucial, a minority always rebelled. Always. They refused to accept the excuses, refused to just follow orders. They took personal responsibility. It demonstrates that deviance, difference, and rebellion all play important roles in adaptation. It makes you ask, doesn't it? How much unacceptable wisdom are we willing to consider in our own lives, in our organizations? Especially when it challenges deeply held norms or makes us stand out. It's easy to conform, but let's be honest, conformity is rarely where the breakthroughs happen.
That is a powerful and slightly unsettling point to reflect on. So, moving beyond just recognizing the problem and challenging wisdom, how do you actually understand and act to adapt successfully? It seems to involve learning quickly from everything, strategic partnering, and having the right kind of relentless ambition. Let's talk about learning fast versus just failing fast. McKeown discusses this in Rule 7. Take the Tropicana rebranding flop in 2009. PepsiCo completely changed their orange juice packaging. Sales dropped 20%. That's $33 million in just 1 month. Ouch, they changed something that clearly didn't need changing, ignored their customers, and yeah, they quickly reverted. But the question McKeown asks is, did they really learn from it, beyond just switching back?
Right. And McKeown's point here is absolutely critical. It's not about celebrating failure. It's about ruthlessly extracting the lessons from it. Think of it less as failing fast and more as learning faster from every single misstep. This needs what he calls a stubborn, open, obsessive focus on learning by doing, basically building a rapid feedback loop. Every experiment, even the ones that totally bomb, immediately informs your next action. It's about turning that aha moment of insight directly into change. No delay. How many times do we see brilliant insights just sit there? Or companies just go back to the old way without truly getting why they failed?
That's the ultimate challenge, isn't it? Closing that gap between knowing you need to change and actually doing it. Contrast Tropicana's quick reversal with something like the original minicar. That was a perfect adaptation, McKeown says, to the 1956 Suez fuel crisis. Sir Alex Agassiz conceived it. A proper miniature car became a design icon. And then there's BMW's super adaptation with the new Mini after they bought the Rover Group in '94. BMW wasn't trying to fail. They were learning fast from their acquisition to hit their own goals. They turned a $2.8 billion investment into over $20 billion in revenue. Now that's learning from someone else's struggles and making it your success.
Precisely. It's about using every piece of information, every outcome, good or bad, as fuel for your next move. It's active, continuous engagement with reality, not just passively reacting.
Okay, so beyond individual learning, the power of collaboration and partners is another key element for adapting. McKeown uses the really fascinating example of Call of Duty's Nazi zombie minigame. That's from Rule 11. It started as just a hobby development by two designers, Jesse Snyder and Jason McCord, who were totally exhausted working on World at Warner. They had this buggy side project, almost ready for the scrap heap. But what's truly fascinating here is how multiple teams and studios, even though they were kind of competing, drove this creative adaptation. Just when it looked like Zombies was dead, senior management stepped in to give Zombies the resources it needed. They brought in a genius designer to polish it up, and it became this massive success. Sold 18 million copies as downloadable content. It's about multiplying partners and opportunities to adapt, creating this vibrant, almost competitive creativity where different teams try to make their adaptation the one fans love most. Why do you think that kind of internal, even competitive collaboration works so well, yet it seems so hard for many organizations to actually embrace?
Well, I think it's because it fundamentally challenges hierarchy and control, doesn't it? Which ties right into the broader idea of thinking better together from Rule 10. Think about the success of M-Pesa in Kenya, that mobile banking service from Vodafone. The key to its adaptive success was that they were willing to think together with the local people, the folks working for Safaricom, the Kenyan company. They took an original idea for microfinance loan repayment and adapted it into a universal money transfer service, really embracing what already worked in Kenya's cash economy. That collaboration, that shared thinking, led to an incredible adaptation perfectly suited to the context. And this contrasts so sharply with Research in Motion, WIM, the BlackBerry makers. McKeown points to RIM as a top-heavy organization with muddled thinking right at the top that just stopped them adapting quickly. Their inability to truly collaborate, to listen beyond their own boardroom bubble, led to a huge loss of market share and credibility in just 5 years. So that clarity of thought that comes from collaboration and the willingness to let good ideas bubble up from anywhere, it's just paramount.
Absolutely. Okay, finally, let's talk about getting your ambition on. Rule 16. It's about that drive, that push beyond what seems possible. The contrast McKeown draws between fashion retailers, Pull and Bear and Gap, is just stark. Pull and Bear rapidly adapts fashion trends. They get the time as the principal factor for their success. They're built for speed, constantly iterating. Meanwhile, Gap was stuck in 7 years of falling sales before they even bothered to change their logo, which was just a superficial attempt at adapting when their whole culture needed a shakeup, not just their products. Their ambition had clearly stalled. Or think about the incredible perseverance of Danny Shechtman and his work on quasi-crystals. He faced ridicule, outright rejection from the scientific community, even from a double Nobel Prize winner who famously told him there is no such thing as quasi-crystals, only quasi-scientists. Ouch. Yet Shechtman kept going for decades, finding supporters, and eventually his unacceptable wisdom was proven right. He got his own Nobel Prize. This just powerfully shows how ambition, especially what McKeown calls ambition beyond the possible, combined with that willingness to challenge orthodoxy and, frankly, handle rejection. That's what truly drives progress. It's about seeing the future, like Bill Gates wanting a computer on every desk back in 1981. It seemed almost absurd to most people then. So we've journeyed through McKeown's insights, and we've seen how successful adaptation is this really dynamic process. It's definitely not a destination you arrive at and then just stop. It's a constant vital cycle. Recognize what's needed, truly understand the challenge, and then bravely act on that understanding.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, McKeown really emphasizes that even small changes, especially ones that kind of redefine the rules of the game, can have the biggest possible long-term impact.
Hmm.
It's about getting past limitations, finding ways to cooperate even when you're competing. We saw this, he argues, in the South African transition from apartheid. Leaders like Mandela and de Klerk demonstrated that tit-for-tat strategy cooperation, forgiveness, moving beyond a really destructive situation to create a new, healthier system. It just reiterates that adaptability isn't just about your own survival. It's often about collective thriving, too.
Absolutely. Ultimately, McHugh suggests that adaptability is fueled by this inner drive to improve, a kind of perpetual dissatisfaction, he calls it, that pushes you to be better, to constantly look for what's next, and never just settle for good enough. See, so for you, our listener, we want to leave you with this thought. What old rules or maybe unacceptable wisdoms are you still clinging to? Or perhaps dismissing outright? Things that might actually be holding you back from your next winning move. The art of winning, it seems, is always just beginning.